Well, welcome everyone to the second session of our time together thinking about Baptists in Ontario. Last week, what I did was, as Chris kindly noted there, was really kind of give background to Ontario Baptist history by grounding it in the history of the province and the way in which Ontario was in the crosshairs of this great struggle for the domination of North America. The political empires, the great empire, European empires of that day being England rather, the United Kingdom. England had kind of swallowed up Wales and Scotland by that point in time, and Ireland. And so we're right to call it the United Kingdom and France. And that struggle went on all through the 18th century, to the point that I'm not sure of the way a Frenchman would have defined himself, but an Englishman defined himself by telling you, I'm not French. And there is this long-standing animosity between those two peoples that eventuated in North America in this long period of war, which was eventually won by the British at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. And then we talked a little bit also about the American Revolution, which was precipitated by some of the ways in which the British settled the situation with what is now the province of Quebec. They had to incorporate Quebec into the British Empire. How were they going to do that? Were they going to allow freedom of religion in terms of the Catholic faith? When there was a long tradition going back to the Reformation that the papacy was the Antichrist. And should we allow the rule of the Antichrist in what would become the province of Quebec? That was a key question. Should we allow the French language? The British had a precedent already, a horrible precedent, where they had basically taken upwards of 20,000 Acadians and forcibly removed them from all of their homes and farmsteads in the province of what is now Nova Scotia and relocated them in the southern United States. Were they going to do that to the Quebecers? And then the whole issue of the French legal system is what we call French civil law. It's very different from British common law in certain aspects. And so were the French going to be allowed their own legal system? And I think the British wisely recommended, there were some who didn't, but the British wisely recommended, and Parliament passed, that Quebec would be allowed to have the Catholic faith. They would be allowed to have French civil law, and they would be allowed to have their own language. To have gone against those would have produced a situation of enormous violence. And Britain was trying to wisely govern. The American colonies didn't like that, and that was a key factor. All of that is known as the Quebec Act, and it's a key factor leading to war between America and her mother country. It's a civil war. I know the Americans call it the American War of Independence, but it's a civil war. It's between men and women who had a shared background, for whom they had a shared government. The King of England, George III, was the King of America. And America rejected the parliamentary democracy that Britain had begun to evolve in favor of a republic. And that's of great importance for us here in Ontario, because 8,000 men and women were not happy with that arrangement and decided to leave America and settle in Ontario in the 1780s. By 1806, the population of Ontario has swollen to 77,000, of which there would have been some Indigenous people, but probably easily 50,000 people of European descent. Most of them British, Scottish, Welsh, and Irish, and some German. And I'll talk a little bit about that constitution as we go forward, not only tonight, but in subsequent lectures. I'll try to give something of the background of what's going on in terms of population growth and politically. So you have some idea of the Baptist life in this period in the 19th and then into the 20th centuries. So some of the people who came with the United Empire Loyalists were Baptists, and those are our origins. But I want to say a little bit about Baptists in the larger English-speaking world. I want to say a little bit about the United Kingdom. We looked at this at great detail last year, 12 weeks. I want to say a little bit about Baptists in America, and then a little bit about Baptists in the Maritimes. As we will see, the Baptists will become the largest Protestant denomination in the Maritimes, in Nova Scotia, and especially in New Brunswick. If you ever have been down there, it's like there's a Baptist church in every village. That probably is a bit of an exaggeration. But Baptists are as thick on the ground in the Maritimes as the United Church, what used to be Methodism, is here in Ontario. And by far, as I said, the largest Protestant denomination in the Maritimes are the Baptists. Now, you would think, given the fact that the Maritimes, what is constituted by today Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island, I'm not thinking of Newfoundland. Newfoundland's a very special case. They do not join Confederation until 1949. Really a late joiner. But those other three provinces, especially New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, very heavily Baptist. And you would think that because they're part of what we call British North America, that they would have an influence on Ontario. They have virtually no influence in shaping Baptist life in Ontario. Baptist life in Ontario develops completely independently of the Maritimes. And we'll see that in its origins. And we'll also see it in the 1920s when there is a great battle for the gospel here in Ontario, in which two names figure largely, McMaster University and T.T. Shields at Jarvis Street. And the Maritime Baptists are hardly affected by that. And Dr. Shields will go down to the Maritimes and try to rouse people to get up in arms about the struggle that he was having in Ontario, and to very little effect. And what is very significant for Canadian Baptist history, but it also reflects Canadian history in general, is that the Maritimes, which once were the center, this is hard to believe, they were once the center of Canadian life in British North America. The fact that there intervenes between the Maritimes and the rest of Canada, the province of Quebec, where you have a very different legal, cultural, religious, linguistic situation, they really are cut off. And when the center of Canadian life will shift to central Ontario and west, the Maritimes will suffer in many, many ways. And they really are, to some degree, in the larger shape of Canadian history, and especially in Canadian Baptist history, a bit of a bywater, or a bit of a, they really are their own distinct development. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Baptists in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, but always bear in mind that the development of Baptist life here in Ontario is not shaped by what's going on in the Maritimes. So let me say a little bit about Baptist life in the Great Britain, or the United Kingdom and Ireland. We looked at this last year, and this is where Baptists begin. They begin in the 1640s in England, in London. They're Puritans. Our roots do not go back to the Anabaptists. Now, by making that, I'm making a controversial statement. There are historians whom I have great respect for who would strongly disagree with me on that. My arguments are based on the fact that there are no organic links to the Anabaptists. The Anabaptists emerge in the 1500s. First of all, in Switzerland, in Zurich. My wife and I were in Zurich about 3 years ago. And we saw the river runs right into the heart of Zurich, where these Baptists were baptized, these Anabaptists, sorry, were baptized, and where some of them were drowned by the Protestant government there for their beliefs. The roots, the legacy of those Anabaptists in the 1500s are the Mennonites and the Hutterites. Obviously, we know a lot about the Mennonites because they're local, right? Hutterites are generally found out west. They share some similarities with those of us who are Baptists. They believe in regenerate churches, those who are evangelical. They believe in believers' baptism. But there are many, very strong differences between the Mennonites and the Hutterites on the one hand and Baptists on the other. And the differences are traceable back to the fact that Baptists have their roots in the Puritan movement in England. In 1644, there were 7 Baptist churches in London. They issued a statement of faith. And by the year 1660, those 7 churches have grown to 130. In 16 years, they have planted around 125 churches. It's a period of remarkable evangelistic growth, revival, and at the backdrop of that is what we call the English Civil War, where the name of Oliver Cromwell is very prominent. And again, we talked about this last year. By the year 1689, there are around 300 of those Baptist churches. So the early history is growth, rapid growth, and then suddenly, well, that's not suddenly, but in the late 1600s, the early 1700s, the Baptist plateau and then begin to decline. So that by 1715, there are 220. So between 1689 and 1715, they lose probably about 80 churches. And then by 1750, they've declined even further. They're now about 150. And they're back where they were 100 years earlier. And we often think that it's liberal churches that decline, but conservative churches can decline too for a variety of reasons. And we can't get into all the details of that because it would take us too far afield. And then at the end of the 18th century, there comes revival. And by the year 1812, in the British Isles, there are close to 600 Baptist churches in England, Wales, and some in Ireland. The Irish Baptist churches in Northern Ireland will become very, very strong in the 19th century. And a scattering of Baptist churches in Scotland. Scottish soil proved impervious to Baptist life for a number of reasons. The Scots preferred Presbyterianism to being Baptist, but this is important, and this will come out next week. Scottish Baptist life is very, very important for Ontario. Very important for Ontario. It'll be Scottish Baptists who plant the gospel in the Ottawa Valley. They will experience revival there. The Bruce Peninsula will be literally filled with Scottish Baptists in the 1850s. William Fraser, who we'll look at in some detail, will go to Tiverton near Kincardine in 1851. Within 20 years, he's planted a church of 400 members, probably 700-800 on a Sunday morning. Tiverton only had a population of probably 200 or 300. And I probably doesn't even have that today. I'm not sure what the contemporary population is. There is a Baptist church there where I've spoken on 2 occasions, evangelical. It's part of the convention. And its roots go back to 1851 when William Fraser planted this church. And up and down the shores of Lake Ontario, he would sometimes walk for days preaching. He could preach in Gaelic as well as English, and he was quite a remarkable evangelist. All of the early leaders in Ontario between 1850 and 1900, apart from a very few, they're all Scots. This might not be well known, but this is a secular element. Every university in Canada that was founded before 1900, except for one, was founded by Scots. The English will use the Scots to build their empire. A lot of Scottish men and women will be very dissatisfied with the way England ruled Scotland in the 18th century, and they'll decide to emigrate, and they'll go to Canada and Australia and New Zealand. Australia and New Zealand are, again, built by the Scots, South Africa, etc. So that's the English situation. England is very, very important. English Baptist life is very important. British Baptist life is very important for Canada and Ontario, because we will get many of our pastors from Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and England in the 19th century. There will be a few Americans, but there's this distrust of America that is definitely there after 1812. Now, let me say a little bit about Baptists in America. So, great growth in the 18th century for the British Isles. Up until the American Revolution, which takes place in the 1770s, 1780s, as I mentioned last week, there are hardly any Baptist churches in America. By 1740, after 80 years of Baptist life in America, there were 24 Baptist churches. They were struggling. They normally had maybe 15, 20, 30 members, a bit of a larger congregation of hearers. If you were living in the 1740s and you're asked the question, what is the future of Christianity in this country? You would say, well, the Baptists are going nowhere. They're small, insignificant. The future of this country is the Congregationalists and maybe the Presbyterians. But it would be the Congregationalists in New England who you would think would be the bearers of evangelicalism and the gospel down through the next 200 years. Nothing could be further from the truth. Congregationalism would basically stay in New England. It would wither, become liberal. There's about 1,000 Congregationalist churches in New England. There might be 20, 30 that are evangelical. Alice and I did a tour. We led a tour of New England 3 years ago, I guess. It would be fall of 2019. We did it with Joel Beakey from Puritan Reformed. Had about 40 people. And we went to a lot of these historic Congregationalist churches in New England, and you knew immediately what you were going into when you came to the outside of the church and there was a rainbow flag. And you knew immediately where these churches stood on a host of issues. And it was very sad. The heartland of, in some ways, Congregationalism in England would be Jonathan Edwards' congregation in Northampton. It is a major center for sexual deviance today. And when I remember a number of years ago going into a bookstore, I was about 500 yards from Jonathan Edwards' church, and I didn't know where it was. There was no sign out front in those days, and I remember going in and asking the bookstore owner, "Could you tell me where Jonathan Edwards' church is?" "Oh, who's that?" Well, I said, "He was a very famous preacher here. Never heard of him. We have a little book back there on Massachusetts. Maybe you can find some help there." I didn't. I walked out the church, I remember very distinctly making a left turn, walking 300 yards, and there was the church. And Congregationalism will wither and die as an evangelical force in New England, and it would be the Baptists who would become the largest Protestant denomination in America. And of course, the Southern Baptist churches, of which I teach at one of their flagship seminaries full time, they have 16,000 churches. It just boggles the mind. 16,000 churches. The Southern Baptist Convention give us at Southern as our they help support the school. They give us around 18 to 20 million a year. That's not even our full budget. That's about a third of the budget. And it's just absolutely remarkable what the Southern Baptists, the influence they have. Now, they've had their issues and so on. We don't need to get into any of that, but you wouldn't have known that in the 1740s. The Baptists were small, insignificant, struggling. It is only after the American Revolution that they would take off and become, because they were able to adapt themselves to the frontier, and because Baptists, they didn't emphasize theological education in America initially, and they were able to incorporate all kinds of people and call men into full-time ministry who didn't have any education. And that has been a strength for us. It can also be a problem for us, as we will see in the story of Ontario Baptists. So that's the British Baptist scene, American Baptist scene. Very, very sketchy, but an overview. And then the Maritimes. The oldest Baptist church in Canada is down in the Maritimes, in Lower Sackville, in New Brunswick. The Baptist churches begin to be formed there in the late 1770s and then 1780s. The key person is a man named Henry Alline. And there isn't always a key individual, but let me put in this in the chat feature so you can see how his name is spelled. He was born in 1748. He was born in Connecticut, and his parents emigrated before the American Revolution. There's his name in the chat box there. We don't have any portrait of him. He was very young when he died, as you can see. He was a rowdy youth. But in the 1770s, he was exposed to the gospel and was thoroughly converted by the time that he was 28. So by around the year 1776, he sensed a call to preach and begins preaching in Falmouth in Nova Scotia. In 7 years, between 1776 and 1783, he has probably preached in every village and town in Nova Scotia. He's itinerant. He would come into the town. If there was no established church there, he would have a portable pulpit. He'd set it up in the town square and just begin to speak. This is a world in which there are no televisions. There's no theater. What are you going to do for amusement? Go and listen to preachers. And it's ideal. It's ideal for preaching, right? And so he was just remarkable. Come wind, come shine, or come bad weather, whatever that saying is. In his diary, he records walking 10, 15 miles in raging snowstorms, his face covered in icicles, his eyelids almost frozen shut, to go to another town to preach. And he basically destroyed his body in this. He preached in probably every town and village in Nova Scotia. Most of the towns are along the coastline in those days. New Brunswick also heavily covered by him. He went to Prince Edward Island only once, which is probably maybe one of the reasons why PEI doesn't have a large Baptist component. He was not a Baptist. This is intriguing. He was a very strong Arminian. He hated Calvinism. And he didn't believe believers' baptism was important. He wasn't going to get, he often said, I'm not going to get involved in battles about whether or not you should get baptized. I'm here to preach the gospel, not to baptize people. In 1783, he was very ill with tuberculosis. He went for a rest to the United States, back to the United States to see family, and he dies there in New Hampshire and is buried in Hampton, New Hampshire. I've only been to New Hampshire once, but it kind of gives me a desire to my poor wife, I've dragged her around all kinds of graveyards. So she's been very, I couldn't have been a historian without her, but I'm thinking, well, I'd love to go to New Hampshire, maybe Hampton, see his grave. But anyway, the people who he preached to gathered themselves into local churches. And when he died, they were really, to some degree, bereft of guidance. And so they reached out to the only Christians they knew, and they were in New England. And the big city in New England was Boston. And the delegation was sent to Boston to try to find a Christian leadership there to help them as churches. And they happened to meet Baptists, Boston Baptists, who are very strong Baptists. They not only were they Baptists, but they were closed communion Baptists, which we'll talk about in a second. And on top of that, they were all Calvinists. So here you've got all these Arminian men and women who've been won to Christ. So we're talking in the thousands, won to Christ. They're formed in churches, but they don't really have, they don't know how to, they don't have preachers necessarily. They don't have leaders. They need guidance. They need shaping as churches. The man who has won them to Christ, he's not interested in Baptists per se. He's not a Baptist himself. He's Arminian. That is, he believes that the freedom of the human will is free to choose or reject Christ without influence from God. And these men and women send to Boston to find help, and the men that they meet there are Baptists, Calvinistic, and really strong Baptists. They're closed communion. So if you'd asked Henry Alline, who should receive the Lord's Supper? Anybody who's a believer. Closed communion Baptists believe that only those who are baptized as believers should partake of the Lord's table. We get baptized as believers, then we partake of the table. And there's an order there. In Ontario, this will be the dominant view, which we'll look at. This will be a cause of contention. This is the dominant view, though, in Ontario, all through the 19th century. And it begins to disappear in the 1920s. And I'm not exactly sure why it begins to disappear. If you go to my family and I, and Graham would have gone with us in those days, we used to go to Port Elgin on holiday, and there's a Baptist church in Port Elgin that I used to walk by. I don't think I've ever been in it. Founded in the 1870s, the building, and it's in the convention. And over the porch of the entrance, it says a regular Baptist church. And the word regular is a code word. It means they're closed communion. It means that you have to be baptized as a believer to partake of the table. And I'll talk about this in more detail later. So Henry Alline, these men and women are converted on Henry Alline. They go to Boston, and there are the people that go there, they're Arminian, they're not Baptists. They meet Calvinistic Baptists who are closed communion. They're not only Baptists, but they're also going to insist, we're going to give you help. We're going to help you form your churches. You're going to be closed communion. And within 20 years, all but one of the churches that effectively were planted by Henry Alline were Baptist and closed communion. And powerfully, what they never lost, though, in other words, they shifted on two key areas from Henry Alline's ministry, but what they never lost was his passion for evangelism. And the story of Baptist life in Nova Scotia is absolutely thrilling in the 19th century. They build a university called Acadia. It becomes the centerpiece of theological education, training young men and women, missions to places like South America, to India, South India, following William Carey. And it's a great story. But in some ways, it's not our story. Because unless you're from Nova Scotia, it's not our story because our roots are very different from those roots. And instead of Baptist here in Ontario being the dominant Protestant denomination, By the 1880s, when somewhere around 80% of women were hearing the gospel, men and women were hearing the gospel every week, only 5% of them were Baptists. 60%, maybe 65% of evangelicals in Ontario in 1880 are Methodists and Presbyterians. The strongest Christian forces in this province are Methodists and Presbyterians. And Baptists are a distant third or fourth or fifth. Depends who you include in the enumeration. So Baptists have never been a large body of churches in Ontario, at least up until probably the late 20th century. Things are changing, and I probably before the end of the course I need to look at contemporary statistics. Of course, we've had in the 20th century the growth of things like the Christian Missionary Alliance, Pentecostalism, the Brethren, and that adds factors which we'll touch on later. So Baptists in Ontario then, let's turn to that. And I want to begin with a map. And I've got about half an hour. I took a far lot longer. I'm a poor judge of what I can speak about. I get caught up in rabbit trails is what some call them. And I thought I'd have more time, but anyway. So let me begin with a map. And last week I had a whole PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to try to do that going forward. But I was going to do that this afternoon, but we Zoomed with our daughter in Vienna. We haven't spoken to her for about 2 months by Zoom, and that took about 2 hours. So anyway, okay, I'll share the map. And the map should be very familiar to you, at least in the general outlines of it. Okay, I hope everybody can see that. Can everybody see that? Yeah, okay. So this is Southern Ontario. It's where we live, Lake Erie. These are all the earliest settlements by United Empire Loyalists before the year 1815. And so you notice that two things about the map. Number one, pretty well all the settlements are along the shores of Lake Erie or Lake Ontario. Partly because to build them back into the bush is going to take a lot of work. I think I mentioned, you can see my cursor. Here's the Bruce Peninsula, which is one of the most beautiful parts of our province. There was a saying in the 1790s that a squirrel could go from here, the Bruce Peninsula, all the way down to York, right here, which is we know as Toronto, and never have to touch the ground. That's just a saying. I'm quite sure it's not exactly true, but it gives you an idea that when you drive through Southern Ontario, you're not seeing the world that our forebears did when they first came to Ontario, or the world of the Indigenous people, the First Nations here, the First Peoples here. It was carpeted with forest. And during the 19th century, the European settlement would level all those forests. They wouldn't have thought about the necessity of conservation of trees and so on. That's a 20th century thing. And so it's not surprising then all of the, and I'm using my cursor here, all of the settlements are either on the shores of the Great Lakes or they're on rivers. See here, Brantford and Dumfries, or London, Ingersoll, Woodstock, etc., on the Thames River or the Grand River. And the only major street or road in this period is Yonge Street. Before 1815, there was a track that was already there, which would become Yonge Street. That's really quite amazing. Now, where did Baptists first appear? Well, there are 4 places. Beamsville, right here. It was called Clinton initially. Beamsville claims that their church was formed before the American Revolution, back in the 1760s, very early 1770s. That's the oral tradition. There is no written evidence of that. And one of the challenges a historian has to deal with, okay, so how do we know something happened or something is true? Well, you've got usually a number of sources. You've got either physical evidence. So if we actually had a building that we could date to 1760, that could prove it. We don't. Or a cemetery often is good. We don't have that either. So then the next thing is written records. Well, we don't have any written records. What we have is oral tradition. And the oral tradition in Beamsville Baptist Church is that we're the oldest Baptist church in Ontario, and we go all the way back to the 1760s. But there is no corroborating evidence. What is clear is that there was a Baptist church there by the 1790s. Where else was there one? There was one here at Boston. It was originally called Townsend. Boston Baptist Church is the oldest Baptist church in the fellowship. It's a beautiful building built in the 1850s. I've been there a couple of times. The actual church dates from around 1803, 1804. That's the congregation. The original building was burned down by an arsonist in the 1850s. Somebody didn't like Baptist and burned the church down. And the present building, which is a brick building, was built in the 1850s. Probably the most beautiful Baptist church in this period, though, is Victoria, which I'll talk about in a second. There are 4 Baptist churches in this area. Ingersoll is a very old one. Thames Street Baptist Church, I think is what it's called now, if it still exists. And when I was going through preparation for tonight, I thought I'd better check that. It's not a fellowship church. It would be a convention church. I'm not sure if it still exists, but there is a Baptist church around 1800 in Ingersoll. So there's one in Beamsville right here, one in Ingersoll, one in Boston, and then one in Victoria, which was then called Charlottesville, named after the very popular Princess Charlotte, a daughter of George III, who died tragically, like Diana, in 1819, and it was absolutely devastating to the British Empire. There were a multitude of funeral sermons for her. But anyway, at some point it was renamed Victoria. The last time I was there, the building was built in about 1810 at the latest. And it was a circular auditorium. That is, the pews were arranged in a kind of a semicircle. And the baptistry had this very unusual, in some ways, picture built behind the baptistry. Painting pictures behind baptistries is pretty common in this period and all through the 20th century, and usually they're of a river. I was baptized at Stanley Avenue Baptist Church. I remember one of the earliest memories of Stanley Avenue when I went there in 74 was looking up at this picture and thinking, man, what's that hokey picture doing? And it took me a long time to appreciate what the picture meant. It was a river, and it kind of was given the impression the river flowed into the baptistry. And that was on purpose, because Baptists in the period we're looking at were always baptized in the open air. And there's this long tradition that you should be baptized in running water and not in a man-made baptistry. And so when Baptists did begin to put man-made baptistries, they'd often put a picture behind the baptistry of a river. But this one in Victoria was particularly striking because standing in the middle of the river was Jesus. I have never seen a baptistry done by this. And the man who painted the picture, I'm gonna close the map there now. The man who painted the picture was a very famous local artist. And when we were there in 2019, I teach a course at Heritage, which I believe I mentioned. I did, yeah, last time. And at the final day of the course, we take a whole day, we pack a lunch, and we go off and we do 6 or 7 churches. It's a great way to see Ontario. And it's always, I usually give the course in the spring and in April. And by April, everybody's, fed up with our winters and you just want to get out. It's great to see the spring coming and so on. And the one year we went to Victoria, and it was about 2018, I think we went there. And I had contacted the church ahead of time, and they made arrangements. I think we had lunch nearby. I remember having lunch nearby at a convention church where Marc Bertrand is the pastor. Anyway, we get there, and the guy gives us the tour of the church, and then he tells us, well, we've sold the building. We're turning it into a nightclub restaurant. And it's actually not funny. It's very sad. And he said, if you know anybody who'd like to buy any of the pews, well, who's buying pews today? And I said, well, you know what I would like somebody to buy is that painting. Because it was done by a very famous in the area artist. I forget what his name was. And it was really worth something. And he said, if you can get somebody down here to take the painting out of the wall, you'd have to cut the wallboard. You can have it, because we're just going to paint over it. We're going to paint it. We can't paint the wall black. And I spoke to some people. Could we go down there? And anyway, it all came to nothing. So I'm assuming they just painted over it, and it's now a nightclub. I don't know. I need to go down in that area and just see what's happened to it. And it's a very sad story of a congregation. It became liberal somewhere in the 20th century and just declined. And I'm surprised that it wasn't registered as a heritage building given its age, and that the government of Ontario wouldn't have stepped in to prevent its sale to become a nightclub. Anyway, so these 4 churches by around 1800 have been planted. And they've been planted by American Baptist missionaries who would come north of the border in spring, and like Methodist circuit riders would go from village to village preaching, and they gathered these 4 churches. People would be baptized in local rivers or ponds or lakes. And by the year 1815, in these 4 churches, there are around 400 members. Not many. Population in 1815 is around 80,000 people in Ontario. So think about it. There's around 400 Baptists in Ontario, with a population of around 80,000 in 1815. They're closed communion. The American Baptists are closed communion. So that means you have to be baptized as a believer to partake of the table. And they're Calvinistic. And theologically, whether or not you're a Calvinist is neither here nor there. Whether or not you believe that the Bible teaches what we call Calvinism, that's neither here nor there. But our Baptist forebears in Ontario were very strongly convinced that salvation is by sovereign grace alone, that prior to us choosing our Lord Jesus, he must draw us to Christ. John 6:44. No man can come to the Father, or no man can come to me except the Father draw him. Now, I don't want to get into a big discussion about Calvinism and so on. There is a tension here between the freedom of the will and the gracious sovereign work of God. But these Baptists were determined to uphold that salvation is God's great work. He deserves the glory for it, and not human. Humans cannot pat themselves on the back for choosing the Lord Jesus. So by 1815, there's around 400. That's a minuscule part of the population of Southern Ontario or Upper Canada, as it was called then. Methodism, on the other hand, is around 20 to 25,000 men and women in Ontario in the early 1800s are Methodists. Baptists are about 400. And that's the pattern for the next 50, 60 years in terms of the numbers of Baptists don't grow. And one of the big questions that you have to ask when you're examining this, why? Why did Baptists grow so rapidly in the Maritimes? They grew so rapidly in the southern United States. They experienced revival in England, England and Wales and Ireland. But here in southern Ontario, they didn't grow. Why is that? And historians have come up with a number of reasons. One of them has been the argument that Baptists were divided over the issue of open and closed communion, because in 1815 there will be after the 1815 war with the United States, there will be a regiment of Highland Gaelic-speaking Scotsmen who are disbanded and they're given the option: you can go back to the Highlands. There's no future for you there. Or you can stay here in the Ottawa Valley, and we'll give you all kinds of land. And most of them stayed. And among those men and women, there would grow a significant number of Baptist churches, which we'll talk about next week. Those Baptist churches are open communion. Who can partake of the Lord's table? Anybody who's a believer in our Lord Jesus. They're closed membership. Who can become a member? You have to be baptized as a believer. But anybody can partake of the table if you're a believer. You don't have to be baptized as a believer. The American Baptist churches planted here in this part of Ontario, they're closed communion. So one of the big arguments, this is the one I first learned when I began studying this period. Well, these two groups of Baptists couldn't agree. And Baptists, being what they were, deeply individualistic, the autonomy of the local church, they weren't going to work together. It's not a great story. It is a great story. It's a fascinating story of a Welsh Baptist named Benjamin Davies, who was open communion. He was living in Montreal. And he decided he wanted to come down and meet some of the Baptists in Southern Ontario. So he found out a group of them were meeting in Port Dover. So he should have written to them ahead of time. They were American Baptist influenced, closed communion. He is British Baptist influenced, open communion. It takes him a week to travel from Montreal to Port Dover. Some of it went by carriage. Some of it he had to go on a barge down the St. Lawrence, pulled by a horse. Some of it he had to walk. Finally, he gets to Port Dover, hasn't told them he's coming. He introduces himself. They find out pretty quickly he's an open communion Baptist. He says, I'd just like to sit in on some of your meetings. They say, well, before that happens, we're going to have to discuss whether we're going to allow you to sit in. They spend 2 or 3 hours discussing it and finally tell him, well, we love you as a brother, but you're open communion. We can't have you sit in on the meetings. It's absolutely bizarre. The poor guy had to trek back. Never really got to know these brethren. He had to go back to Montreal, another trek of 2 weeks. That is far too typical of what's going on in this period. The inability of these men and women to work together. The other thing, too, that is involved here is political. Nearly all the Baptists in the United States supported the revolution. And in fact, during the War of 1812, some of the American Baptist missionaries who came to Ontario found themselves caught in Ontario when the war broke out. You can imagine this, okay? Let's say God forbid, we're in a war of America, and we've got an American Baptist visiting West Highland, and he's preaching that Sunday. And what does he preach about? Why America is right in the war. And he might even pray that America wins the war. A number of these American Baptist preachers got arrested, imprisoned during the War of 1812. But if you're living in the area, okay, those Baptists, they had some yahoo from the United States preaching to them. We've just imprisoned him because he was preaching treason. You're not likely to want to go to their churches, right? Makes a lot of sense. So there's a political factor. To be a Baptist was associated with American republicanism. And that is inevitably going to be a factor. I mean, one of our challenges, I think, in our present day, when I use the word evangelical, what do I mean by that? Now, when I use it, I'm thinking of this glorious heritage that goes back to men like Spurgeon and the Wesleys and Whitfield and the Puritans. But when somebody in our culture hears it, they might be thinking of the people who stormed the Congress on January the 6th last year, right? That's not what I mean by an evangelical. So evangelical has got caught up in politics, and so did the word Baptist. To be a Baptist in Canada, in Ontario, in the 18 teens and the 1820s was to be a sympathizer with American republicanism. And that probably was a factor. There's another key factor, and then I'll conclude with at this point. The other key factor is the inability of Baptists to agree to work together in theological education. And leadership is vital. And we need schools, Orthodox, godly Christian schools to train leaders. And Baptists there'll be 80 years in this province before they finally get a school. And when they get a school, they locate it in Woodstock, and we'll talk about that. And it's known as the Canada Literary Institute. Eventually, it'll move to Toronto at the corner of Bloor Street and University on the southwest corner. And if you know that, there's a beautiful building there, right next to the ROM. You've got the ROM with that horrible thing jutting out, completely destroys the architecture of it. And then next door, there is a gorgeous building. They sandblasted it, and it's now the Royal Conservatory of Music. But that was McMaster University, built with Baptist money in the 1880s to be a place where we would send our young people, and they would get a Christian education, and that's where we would train our ministers. But that's way in the future. The Presbyterians and Methodists knew the importance of theological education, and they had schools by the 1830s. Victoria College, Methodist, part of University of Toronto now. Knox College, Presbyterian. And Baptists are another 30 years beyond that. And that hurt us as a denominational group. Now, let me say one last thing. In my heart of hearts, where the gospel is preached and Christ is exalted, that's the critical thing. But I'm a Baptist, and I believe in a regenerate church membership. I believe in believers' baptism. I believe in congregational church government. And those are important principles. They're not the final. You don't have to believe those to be in the kingdom. Of course not. But I think those are important biblical themes. And so while I'm called upon to love all who love the Lord Jesus, I should never be ashamed of being a Baptist. And that's kind of it'll be a sub-theme that's going through our time together, that we should love all who love the Lord Jesus and not criticize them for not being Baptist. But we should never be ashamed to own who we are. Okay, let me stop here. Next week, what I'd like to do, and I'll take questions at this point. Next week, what I'd like to do is I'd like to I'll begin around 1815 and go to about 1860 next week and talk about the influence of the Scottish Baptists and the attempts to work together that failed and why they failed.